The concrete mixer churned in the morning heat, steel drum rotating with mechanical precision. Gray slurry poured down the chute into wooden forms that would become the foundation of another Los Angeles office building. The sound echoed off surrounding structures, creating the industrial symphony that meant progress, employment, and men earning honest wages for honest work. Charles Bronson stood beside his rental car, watching the construction crew work with the practiced eye of someone who understood the rhythm. Tuesday morning, 1979, he wasn't here for a movie role, wasn't researching a character, was here because his business manager had invested in this commercial development and Bronson wanted to see where his money was going. The Westwood Plaza project, 16-story office building that would house law firms and accounting practices and the kind of businesses that measured success in billable hours rather than concrete poured. But first, someone had to pour that concrete. Someone had to build the foundation that would support all that white-collar ambition. Bronson knew construction sites, had worked them for 10 years before Hollywood discovered him. Pennsylvania coal mines first, then construction when mining jobs disappeared, carrying bags of cement, mixing mortar, laying brick until his hands bled and his back screamed, and he understood that physical labor wasn't just work, it was education about what men could endure when they had families to feed. The crew was mixed. Young men with strong backs and something to prove, middle-aged men with experience and mortgages, older men with knowledge that couldn't be taught in trade school, all of them united by the understanding that construction was honest work that built the world everyone else lived in. The foreman's name was Mike Torrino, 28 years old, USC engineering degree, 2 years of site management experience, company fast-track program designed to move college graduates into supervisory positions without wasting time on learning construction from the ground up. Mike saw his current position as preparation for project management, then development, then ownership of his own firm by age 40. Mike understood construction as engineering principles applied through efficient labor management, load calculations, and material costs and schedule optimization. What Mike didn't understand was the human element, the way experience compensated for declining physical strength, the way older workers taught younger ones lessons that couldn't be found in textbooks. The older worker's name was Frank Kowalski, 61 years old, 38 years in construction, started as a laborer in 1941, worked his way up to skilled craftsman, served 2 years in the Pacific during the war, came back to build the post-war boom in California. Houses and schools and office buildings and shopping centers, helped construct the infrastructure that turned Los Angeles from a small city into a metropolis. Frank's hands were permanently stained with concrete dust and motor oil. His back was bent from decades of lifting heavy materials. His knees ached every morning when he got out of bed, but his knowledge was encyclopedic. He could look at a foundation form and know if it was properly braced, could feel concrete setting up just by touching it, could spot problems before they became disasters. Frank was training Tommy Reeves, a 19-year-old kid fresh out of high school. Tommy had strong arms and good intentions, but no understanding of construction fundamentals. Frank was teaching him how to read blueprints, how to check concrete consistency, how to work safely around heavy equipment, the kind of education that took years to complete and could save lives when properly applied. Mike had been watching Frank for weeks, timing his movements, measuring his productivity against younger workers, calculating his value to the project based on output per hour rather than quality of work or training provided to new employees. The problem from Mike's perspective was efficiency. Frank moved slowly, took time to explain things to Tommy, stopped work to check measurements twice when once should be enough, represented the kind of old school approach that slowed down modern construction schedules. Mike had been pressuring Frank to work faster, reminding him that the company valued productivity, suggesting that maybe experienced workers needed to adapt to contemporary pace expectations, hinting that changes might be necessary if performance didn't improve. Frank absorbed the criticism quietly, tried to work faster, made mistakes he'd never made before, worried about job security for the first time in 38 years. Went home exhausted, not from physical labor, but from the stress of proving he still belonged. This morning, Mike was watching Frank teach Tommy how to test concrete consistency, standard procedure that required taking samples every few hours to ensure proper curing. Frank was showing Tommy how to perform a slump test, how to interpret the results, how to recognize when concrete was too wet or too dry or mixed incorrectly. The lesson was taking longer than Mike thought necessary. Standard procedure that experienced crews could complete in minutes was stretching into an educational session that slowed down the overall operation. Mike approached Frank and Tommy during the concrete testing, clipboard in hand, stopwatch visible, authority projected through body language and proximity. Frank, Mike said loudly, voice designed to be heard by other workers. How long is this going to take? Just showing Tommy the proper procedure, Mike. He needs to understand how to test consistency. He can learn that on his own time. We've got a schedule to maintain here. Frank's face remained neutral. 38 years of dealing with supervisors had taught him when to argue and when to absorb criticism. But something about Mike's tone bothered him, the dismissal of training, the assumption that experience didn't matter. Kid needs to know how to do this right, Frank said quietly. Bad concrete means starting over. That costs more time than teaching him properly the first time. Mike's expression hardened. Frank, you've been doing this job for a long time, maybe too long. Maybe you've forgotten that this isn't a school, it's a construction site. We're not here to hold hands and explain every little detail. Other workers had stopped to listen. The confrontation was becoming public, entertainment and education combined. The old guard versus new management, experience versus efficiency. Times have changed, Mike continued. Modern construction means modern pace. If you can't keep up, maybe you should think about making room for people who can. Frank's hands tightened around his clipboard. 38 years of building things, 38 years of showing up, regardless of weather or physical pain. 38 years of loyalty to companies that measured him in output rather than knowledge. Being told he was obsolete by a kid with a degree and no understanding of what construction really required. Tommy looked uncomfortable, caught between the man teaching him valuable skills and the supervisor who controlled his employment, wanting to defend Frank but needing the job too much to risk confrontation. Old timers like Frank represent the past, Mike announced to the crew. Slow, inefficient, resistant to change. Modern construction needs modern workers who understand that time is money and efficiency is everything. The words cut Frank like physical blows. 61 years old. 38 years of experience reduced to a productivity problem that needed solving. His knowledge dismissed as obstruction. His training of young workers seen as waste rather than investment. Maybe, Mike said, it's time for old timers to step aside, make room for people who can handle the pace we need here. That's when Charles Bronson walked over from his car, not fast, not aggressive, just moved from his position as observer to participant, boots, making no sound on the concrete. Suddenly he was there, standing beside Frank, wearing work clothes that looked natural rather than costume, looking like someone who belonged on a construction site. Mike recognized Bronson immediately, movie star, famous face, investor in the project, the kind of person whose opinion mattered to the company executives who controlled Mike's career advancement. Mr. Bronson, Mike said, quickly shifting to professional courtesy. Didn't expect to see you here today. How can we help you? Bronson looked at Mike, then at Frank, who was trying to process being dismissed in front of a movie star, then at Tommy, who was watching the entire interaction with wide eyes. This man, Bronson said quietly, gesturing toward Frank. How long has he been in construction? Frank? 38 years. But experience isn't everything in modern. 38 years of building things that don't fall down. Well, yes, but 38 years of knowing how to train young workers safely, how to spot problems before they become disasters, how to do the job right the first time. Mike nodded uncertainly, not sure where this was going, not sure if Bronson was supporting him or challenging him. And you just told him he's useless? I wouldn't say useless. I was just discussing productivity standards in front of other workers, in front of the kid he's training, in front of men who've been learning from him for years. Mike's confident demeanor started to crack, understanding that he might be in trouble, that publicly humiliating an experienced worker in front of Charles Bronson wasn't the leadership demonstration he'd intended. Bronson turned to Frank. What were you showing the boy? Concrete testing, Mr. Bronson, making sure it's mixed right before we pour the foundation. Important work. Yes, sir. Bad concrete means the whole building comes down eventually. Bronson looked back at Mike, 38 years of experience teaching life and death skills to a 19-year-old kid. And you want to replace that with what? Speed? Mike opened his mouth to explain about efficiency metrics and productivity standards in modern construction management, stopped when he saw the look in Bronson's eyes, the look of a man who'd worked construction sites when mistakes meant more than schedule delays. Son, Bronson said, his voice carrying across the work site, let me tell you something about old-timers. Mike waited, Frank waited, Tommy waited. Other workers stopped their tasks to listen, everyone understanding that something important was happening. I worked construction for 10 years before I got into movies, carried cement bags, mixed mortar, laid brick until my hands bled. And you know what I learned? Pause, let that sink in. The old-timers were the only thing standing between me and getting killed on the job. They taught me how to read load limits, how to spot dangerous conditions, how to work around heavy equipment without getting crushed. They saved my life a dozen times by sharing knowledge you can't learn from books. Bronson gestured toward Frank. This man has 38 years of that knowledge, 38 years of preventing accidents, 38 years of training kids like Tommy to go home safe to their families every night. 7 seconds. That's how long Bronson spoke. 7 seconds to completely reframe the conversation. 7 seconds to turn Mike's efficiency lecture into an education about real construction management. 7 seconds to restore Frank's dignity and question Mike's judgment. The construction crew was listening intently, everyone understanding that they just witnessed something important. An experienced worker being protected by someone who understood what experience actually meant. You want to know what's inefficient? Bronson continued, having to rebuild a foundation because nobody taught Tommy how to test concrete properly, having to shut down the site because an inexperienced worker got hurt doing something Frank could have prevented, losing good workers because they feel disrespected by management that doesn't understand their value. Mike stood there processing, understanding that he'd miscalculated completely, that his attempt to demonstrate modern management had backfired in front of the project investor, that Charles Bronson had just given him a master class in leadership while surrounded by his subordinates. Frank, Mike said quietly. Continue with the training. Take whatever time you need. Frank looked at Bronson with something between gratitude and amazement. 38 years of taking orders from supervisors who measured everything except what mattered. Finally hearing someone defend the value of experience and knowledge. Thank you, Mr. Bronson. Nothing to thank me for, just stating facts. Frank returned to training. Tommy explained concrete testing procedures, answered questions, shared knowledge that would keep the young man safe for the rest of his career. Professional education delivered without the fear of being criticized for thoroughness. Bronson started to walk back to his car, stopped, turned to Mike. Son, you've got a crew of experienced professionals here, men who've been building things since before you were born. Don't waste that knowledge by confusing speed with quality. Construction isn't about how fast you can work, it's about how well you can build things that last. Mike nodded. Yes, sir, I understand. Bronson left. Mike returned to his trailer office. Frank continued training Tommy, but something fundamental had changed. The pressure to rush was gone, replaced by the understanding that someone valued what he knew. Someone recognized that 38 years of experience couldn't be replaced by enthusiasm and efficiency metrics. 2 weeks later, Mike was transferred to a different project. Company cited concerns about worker morale and project management approach. Frank received a letter from corporate commending him for dedication to safety and training excellence. Frank worked construction for another 4 years, trained dozens of young workers, taught them not just how to handle tools and materials, but how to think like craftsmen, how to take pride in building things that would outlast their careers, how to understand that construction was about creating lasting value, not just meeting deadlines. When Frank retired at 65, his last day became a celebration. Workers brought beer. Supervisors shared stories about lessons learned from Frank. Management praised him as an example of what dedicated craftsmanship looked like. Tommy, the 19-year-old Frank had been training, became a project supervisor himself 12 years later, never forgot the concrete testing procedures Frank taught him, never forgot the lesson about treating experienced workers with respect, built a reputation for safety and quality that traced back to an old-timer who took time to teach things properly. Mike eventually became a successful project manager, but he never forgot the lesson Charles Bronson taught him in 7 seconds about the difference between managing schedules and leading people, about understanding that experience has value that can't be measured in productivity reports, about treating workers as human beings rather than interchangeable parts. Charles Bronson never spoke about that morning publicly, never mentioned it in interviews, never used it to promote himself as someone who stood up for working people. Just another moment where he chose to defend what was right against what was expedient. 7 seconds to teach 3 lessons. That experience matters more than efficiency. That knowledge is more valuable than speed. That real leadership protects people instead of dismissing them. 7 seconds that rippled forward through Frank's remaining 4 years of work, through Tommy's career in construction, through Mike's understanding of what management actually meant. Frank lived to be 79, told the story of Charles Bronson's intervention to his grandchildren, not as a celebrity encounter, but as an example of what happens when someone with authority chooses to use it responsibly. 7 seconds that proved respect is earned through years of dedication, not lost to changing times. The Westwood Plaza building still stands today, solid foundation, quality construction, built by men who understood that doing things right was more important than doing things fast. 7 seconds in a construction site, 7 seconds that reminded everyone that the old-timers weren't useless. They were irreplaceable. That's what real strength looks like. Not the ability to dismiss others, but the wisdom to value what they've built. 7 seconds to prove that experience is the foundation everything else stands on. And sometimes all it takes to protect that foundation is someone willing to speak truth to power.